Our lesson starts out with a glorious day for David and a good day for Saul. The drawn-out stalemate between Israel and the Philistines finally ended. Goliath had every Israelite soldier shaking in their armor, embarrassing Saul. With Goliath dead at the hands of David, Abner brings David to report to Saul, and Saul inquires about the lineage of David. Now, David is a national hero. King Saul receives David into his household, and no more does David return to the home of his father. Obviously, Jonathan is impressed with David's victory over Goliath, but David's words to his father seem to be the most impressive to Jonathan. By the time David and Saul finished their conversation, Jonathan, the son of Saul, was so impressed with David that he formed an immediate bond like a brother. He became a committed advocate and friend. Jonathan was no dummy. He surely knew that David was competition to succeed his father as king, moving him to the side. But his deep fraternal love for David made them become one as they made a covenant that day. Like many covenants, Jonathan formalized this covenant with solemn gifts. He gave David his royal robe and weapons, armor, sword, bow, and belt. In the Old Testament, the robe was a symbol of authority. Jonathan's gift of his robe and armor to David can be viewed as symbolic of him relinquishing his claim to royal ascension. As time goes on, whatever Saul assigns to David, David does it, and he does it well. So well that Saul puts him in charge of his military operations. All of Israel approve and admire David's leadership. Here we have two contrasting types of friendships. With David and Jonathan, it's an example of holding your friends close, for they had a healthy relationship, not competing, not jealous, rather supporting each other, enjoying the success of each other as their own. David and Saul, that's an example of holding your enemies even closer, for they had a toxic relationship. Saul used David as he needed him, but Saul was jealous of David's victory and fame to the extent that Saul is paranoid over David. He hopes that harm will befall David. Imagine being the king, the commander-in-chief, and every time the Philistine warlords would come out to do battle, David and his men would beat them, upstaging Saul's men. David's wisdom, undoubtedly a product of the Spirit, set him apart from all the other commanders. As David's fame grew and status grew, Saul did not like being in second place. He realized that God was with David, and even his daughter Michal loved David. So Saul's fear of David increased to hatred. At this point, Saul orders his servants, including Jonathan, to kill David. But Jonathan has made a covenant with David, and he loves David as himself. Jonathan is in a dilemma at this point. He can obey his father, violating his covenant, or he can keep his covenant, disobeying his father. Divided loyalties still perplex modern Christians. Jonathan sought the win-win, seeking to reason with Saul and convince him to revoke the order to kill David. In the next part of our lesson, Jonathan arguably betrays his father's confidence, and we can debate whether it is ethical for someone to betray a confidence to do the right thing. Nonetheless, behind his father's back, Jonathan warns David of his father's order. He urges David to be on guard and to hide until after he could speak to his father. Strangely, he tells David he will meet with his father in the very place where David is to hide. This plan puts David in a position to observe the discussion between Jonathan and Saul. Additionally, Jonathan promises to report the outcome of his discussion with his father to David. While yes, you could question Jonathan's ethics as a double agent, you can also look at him as a tool of God being used to seek to bring these two men together for the greater good of Israel. Jonathan is walking a chalk line, but Jonathan's dealings with his father on behalf of David are a model for all of us. First, in Jonathan, we have a friend who loves his brother as himself. Confronting a somewhat paranoid Saul is dangerous, yet Jonathan takes the risk for his friend. Second, Jonathan subordinates his own personal interests in the throne to those of David for the best interest of Israel. Third, Jonathan is a faithful and submissive son. Jonathan approaches his father Saul directly and speaks to him with respect. He speaks well of David. He appeals for David's life, and he appeals for his father to do the right thing. He reminds Saul that David is his most faithful and devoted servant. He reminds his father that David's actions have benefited Saul, that when David killed Goliath, he rejoiced in David's victory because it was Saul's victory also. To act against David would not be just or wise, and would be even worse, a sin, to shed innocent blood. Saul is convinced, so Jonathan calls David to tell him about the meeting with his father and brings him back to his father's presence. Saul swears that as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. But remember, theirs is a toxic relationship, and as in most toxic relationships, the toxins rise again. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.